Hello and welcome back to another update. In this one, we'll be covering the latest updates from the front line. Starting out in the Kreminna front, we see here to the south of Kreminna, there are some Russian advances in the Kreminna Serbiansky forest area. We see that they've managed to capture this part of the road here southwest of Kreminna, closing in on the next intersection here in the southern parts. If they manage to capture further parts, they are able to reach the intersection and they'll cut off the road leading up and down in the Serbiansky forest area, similar to one of these intersections they've managed to cut off today, which indicates that they are planning on going westwards. After this, they may try to cut off the Ukrainian forces here through the forest lines. If they manage to take control of one of these roads and move down one of them, they'll be able to cut off the Ukrainian forces and create a pocket of them here in the southern parts, as there is generally no return other than going through the rivers here to the south if they manage to reach these parts. So that is most likely their objective. They're trying to push westwards, trying to cut off the Ukrainian forces within the forest area, which will allow them to capture it at a faster rate than just going through it. Then we also see here in the northern part that the Russian forces have managed to advance here to the southwest of Liman Pershi, going around Sinkivka instead of going through straight at it and going down the river line. And as I mentioned in my previous video, this is to get a proper flank, as it allows them to hold the river line, and then they'll be able to move eastwards or southwards of Vilshana in a direction cutting off Sinkivka from its only supply route in and out of it, and then generally just advance here to the east of Kupiansk. So we're seeing the Russians intensify their offensive actions in this part of the front line. And then finally here to the southwest of Oryhiv in the Zaporizhia front, the Ukrainians have been pushed out of Pyathatki. According to the latest reports, the village is in a gray zone. It was earlier reported that the Ukrainians captured it, then the Russians captured it, then the Ukrainians captured it, then the Russians captured it, and this went on repeat. So generally right now it's just a gray zone, as the latest update was Syriac Maps claiming Russians had control over it, but then there was a video from Deep State Maps showing that the Russians were shelling it. So generally, we don't know the timestamp of this video. Could be after the Syriac update, which would indicate it being under Ukrainian control. Could be before, which would indicate it being under Russian control. Either way, it's generally a gray zone since it keeps exchanging hands so often. And then we take a look at this video here, which is in one of the recent counterattacks executed by the Russian forces. We see that the Russian forces in this video take some losses due to artillery fire from the Ukrainian side as they try to advance with their armored vehicles. So losing armored vehicles to artillery isn't a one-side thing. Both sides can take these losses. However, considering the Ukrainians are on the offensive in the general front line and the Russian forces have a lot more artillery, 7-1 advantage, then of course the losses will lean in favor of the Russians. Generally on the front line, the Ukrainian forces are continuing their probing attacks. There doesn't seem to have been any territorial changes here on the Zaporizhia front over the past 24 hours. What we're seeing is that they continue these probing attacks, trying to test out the Russian defenses continuously. This is the 18th day of the offensive, and so far they haven't confirmed on these probing attacks. This indicates that the Russian defenses seem to be way more fortified than they expected, and it's way more difficult for them to find a weak point, since the Russians have generally made defenses that is essentially very strong on all parts of the front line. So what we may see is that they'll try to continue probing to see if there's some hidden weaknesses to these defensive positions. But from these probing attacks, we see these two following videos. The first one is of a Ukrainian self-propelled gun that is hit by Russian artillery. And the second one is here a Russian FPV kamikaze drone flying directly down into a Leopard 2A6 on the Ukrainian side. So if it is destroyed, damaged, whatever, it's very difficult to tell from this video, but it doesn't seem to really have been that hurt. It may be that the FPV drone is not really that powerful on the Russian side, or that they just hit the hull of the Leopard tank where it's better fortified, not at the ammunition areas where they are weak. So generally this shows that the Leopard tanks, although the 2A6 isn't exactly unbeatable, it is still very tough. And then we move on to this next piece of news, which is from a meeting that Putin adhered to, where he was explaining the situation and general status of the war in Ukraine. He says that the Russians do not need any new volunteers for the operation. Today, 114,000 people have signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense. On average, 1,336 people enter a contract per day. That is, we receive a regiment every day. So that is what the Russian President Vladimir Putin is saying. He's saying that they're receiving 1,336 people to the Russian army every day. That is equivalent to a regiment every day. And that they have 114,000 people who have signed the contracts and are now ready to fight after months of training, and that they are being trained on 8 training grounds. He's saying that there are currently more than 50,000 volunteers being trained at 8 training grounds under the guidance of more than 600 instructors, and that he expects this army, this 114,000 strong army, to be ready by the end of June. So in the next week, they will have another 114,000 soldiers ready for the fighting. That is on top of the estimated of 400 to 500,000 soldiers on the Russian side. This would increase it significantly, and it will definitely have an impact on the battlefield. If the Russians are able to just send these 116,000 at one point of the front line, then that would put severe strain on the Ukrainian defenses, and would need to match that if, for example, they use it to attack in the Kharkiv area or generally a different part of the front line. They'll need to relocate a lot of forces to that part. And now that they're launching their own offensive, the Ukrainians are continuing their attacks in the Zaporizhia front. That would put severe strain on their forces, as they are already using some of the offensive power here in the south. If they are then being attacked elsewhere, that would definitely be a huge issue for the Ukrainian forces. As for the general situation on the front line right now, the Ukrainian forces are attacking in specific areas. They're mainly focusing their forces here south of Velika Novosilka, both on the eastern side but also to the western side, where they try to push the Russian forces out of these hills to the west of the river line, and also here to the west of that, trying to put pressure on a wider front. At the same time, we've also seen activation of Ukrainian forces by Huliaipole, which could indicate some attempts on the front line right there. And we also see continuous attacks here south of Orikhiv, both in the direction of Novodarivka, also in the direction of Robotyne. And finally, we also see more fighting by Lobkove here in the direction of Khatki. So generally, we're seeing a lot of fighting here on the Zaporizhia front. Although they claim a operational pause, we've not really seen much of that. There has been a decrease, but it is mostly just continuing of the probing attacks, not any of these armored columns we've seen at the start. This could also just be a change of strategy, where they try to save up on their armor so that they avoid further losses that could put a danger on the success of the offensive on their part. And that is all for today's update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.